going to be recorded. There it is. It's like I can predict it. It's like I'm magic. So that's today what we're going to do. Just a quick reminder, SPSS on your computer. How's that coming? Have you been able to reach out to, what is it? IT, PC support? Anyone having any struggles, any issues with that? All right, that's good. But if you do have any problems with it, try testing it out. Try opening it up, making sure that it's functionable. You don't have to like open up a data set. You can go download. You probably won't know what to do with it yet. But you can go download the example data set from the Moodle page. Feel free to open that up in SPSS. How you can tell that it's working is that it just opens up for you. You can see the data. You don't have to do anything with it. Obviously, we'll get all to that. But feel free to test that out just to make sure that it's actually working. So there's no surprises once you get into practicing stuff. So please let me know if you need any extra support on that. How did the first couple recorded sessions go? How's that coming along on Monday and Wednesday? Any questions from those days? Any issues with setup or accessing anything? Grant, has Ulicia been helpful at all? Great. Great. She's a resource for y'all. So that's good. Good. Thanks for the thumbs up, Neil. Let's get into I told you I'm going to have questions of the day most every day. So here is the question of the day today. It's not assignment related, and I already see the thoughts whirling in their head. What does sociology mean to you? How do you see sociology connecting to your study? Because we have, quite a few students here that aren't sociology majors or minors. I'm actually not exactly quite sure the composition of everybody's majors, minors, undeclared, all that sort of stuff. But curious, because we kind of went through, I think it was like the first day, right? The first like actual class day besides the introduction, where we went over to some like key concepts in sociology. I think we did that. So I'd be curious what y'all think. So who wants to go first with the tough question?
I can go. So, I think I can easily just say sociology is to me is just the way of looking at humans and their social behavior from like a scientific study standpoint. And I think it just connects to my studies and like I'm in another class of the study of human behavior. And to me, I think all that's just really cool because I just like to study why people do the things they do. And it's just another way to look at things. And I think that's just the way I can connect it to my other studies.
For sure. I like it. Who's next?
Um, I'm going into social work, and I think it's like obviously it relates pretty closely with that. To me, it's like means a lot because I mean, kind of like Jacob said, it explains a lot of human behavior and why people do things, which is, I mean, really important in social work.
Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I worked in the organization I was at prior to the one I'm currently with was like a disability mental health services nonprofit. So in that social work realm, lots of sociology, former sociology students, a lot of folks that went to grad school for sociology in there. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a good point. It's a good point. Who's next?
I can go. Um, I would agree with Jake. It's just kind of like the study of people and their behavior in certain environments. And I'm also a social work major. So there's a lot of similarities, like just a bunch of systems theory, like conflict theory, all those things is pretty relevant in social work, just kind of studying how to best help people.
Love it. Love it. Luke, I got actually a random question for you. Are you related to Dr. Loberg by chance?
Yeah, it's my mom.
I'll be darned. I was just had a meeting with her last night. She's the best.
Yeah, she's
Better remind her that she's the best. Moms are the best, Luke.
all right, I'll tell her that.
Tell her that I sent you. All right, thanks,
I
Luke.
will.
Who's next?
I'm gonna go next. I'd say sociology is the study of society, basically, if I had to like water it down. And I'm a social work major myself, so I kind of see the correlation, especially at a macro level in social work. So kind of policy and all that. So I could see it in if when we're trying to create policies and how that would affect our society as a whole. So I kind of see that correlation as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, really good. Sociology is a good perspective for policymakers. Absolutely. I think we need more of it. Truthfully, I think we need more sociology in some of our public policy, for sure. Yeah, Randy, raise your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt, so that's why I raised my hand. But
Sure.
sociology, to me, it means like the study of like people's behavior, and that kind of relates to my well, study slash major because I'm a social work major, so I'm always working with like patients and stuff, like from different backgrounds, and with that obviously comes like different behaviors. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that sort of cultural competence in a way, for our service delivery and whatnot. We're actually talking about that, I think, right now in our medical sociology course right now. So it's that's a really important piece. Absolutely. Who's next?
I can go. So I'm also a social work major, and basically we just like it's about helping people in communities. And I think sociology like makes us understand like the root problem of that, so it can help a lot in social work.
100%. Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. Again, thinking about that public policy piece. One thing we talked about in medical sociology, this is a spoiler for students. I don't think there's any students in here in that class, is there? But we're going to be talking maybe a future class. But one of the things we'll talk about, we have a whole segment dedicated to public policy in that class. And one is talking about inductive versus deductive approaches. Deductive being like, how do we address the root causes of issues, which are more like social factors, like socioeconomic status, those types of disparities, education. And to your point of like understanding root causes of things and disparities at a structural level rather than just that individual experience. I think that's great. Cool. Who is next?
I can go. I bet you'll never guess what major I am. I'm also a social work major. Um, honestly, I don't know. I kind of agree with everybody else since I'm like one of the last ones to go. There's not a whole lot else I can add to it connecting to social work, but it's definitely also important and super relevant to the rest of the things that we're learning.
Totally. Absolutely. Absolutely. Who wants to go next?
I can go. I'm a sociology minor, but I'm also a writing major. And I think it's just really important to understand people and society for writing characters and stories.
I like that a lot. That's a good application of that. That's really great. That's really great. Who's next?
Yeah, I can go. I just think like understanding that the actions people take and what people do like are influenced by like larger systems and factors that the society creates is really interesting. So just learning about that and how that works is what it means to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like that. I like it. Who's next?
I can go. I think sociology means to me like how people interact with different groups and just with each other and like the community and cultures. And then it connects to my studies because I am also a social work major and just like learning how to interact with different people and communities.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That perspective of sociology. You know, I think just from a personal standpoint, not being, centered in academia for my whole career by any means, having a sociological perspective, allowing yourself to, take the perspective or see more broadly the contexts of other people as you're entering in whatever career path you're going to go, that can be a really useful tool. Not saying you have to be a sociology major to be good at that by any means, but I think that sociological perspective can really benefit whatever career that you go into, especially if there's that sort of human interaction side, like social work, right? That a lot of us here are evidently, of going and understanding and having that sort of cultural relevancy. And at least, and what I mean by that is you don't have to understand everyone's culture, right, to be good at your job when you work with people. It's that you need to have that openness and understanding that there are other broader factors and forces at play here. Yeah, that's great. I think, is that everyone, or do we have one more?
Yeah, I can go. I'm Alex, by the way. Actually a business management major, but sociology, what it means to me, I'd say, is like the study of social life and how like it has consequences on like human behaviors, like most people here have been talking about, and how it connects to my studies. Being a business management major, I would just say like how well ethically like a company is ran, like that really plays an important role in like human behavior, and that like things need to go right in order to be successful.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, sociology from a business standpoint. Oftentimes people don't think about like sociology and business, but I'll tell you, as someone who's been in a couple different startups with sociologists, it can be a huge benefit, especially organizational sociology. We think about, again, like to your point, just understanding people and cultures better. I mean, it's huge. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for indulging with a question of the day. One quick question before we get started. We went over like the different types of variables. Remember I think the very most recent recording, probably like nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio level variables. I think that was in that recording. I can go back and check. Any questions on any of that? We'll go over it again because that's going to be part of like your survey assignment. But any questions on any of those materials that we went through? Just want to do a double check. All right. Aces all around. I like it. All right. Let's get into some research ethics then. It's going to be enthralling, I promise. Research ethics is really, really important when we think about research, especially with people, right? If I'm doing research on or with other human beings, there's a lot of nuances that go into that. So why do you think, if someone could just give me a sentence or two, why do you think that these ethical standards exist? Why should they? Why do they exist? Why is that important to have?
I guess just broadly, if you're using people as like case studies or subjects, you don't want to harm them physically or emotionally or mentally or something. You just want to protect the health of people you may be studying.
100%. Yeah. Harmlessness is huge. Yeah, Jamin, you had a comment?
Yeah, this also helps with like people with different cultures and make sure you're maintaining cultural sensitivity and just like treating everybody the same with ethical standards.
Absolutely, right. Harmlessness, fairness, equity, all of that is a part of why research ethics exists. So ethical standards, what they do is they provide more formal guidelines to all of us as potential researchers, essentially a code of ethics to ensure that our research is conducted responsibly, and especially sociological research, right? Because that's a lot of times dealing with people, sometimes quite directly, like interviews, focus groups, surveys, those sorts of things. So these types of guidelines that we're going to talk about today outline various principles and standards and procedures for addressing even unethical behavior. So we can identify when unethical behavior does come up. We know that that's happening and how to address it and where to go. And so ethical codes are oftentimes developed specifically by various other, it's not just an individual thing, right? It's organizations, it's other institutions, other professional bodies, all have codes of ethics that really are derived from the standard research ethics that we know to exist. So does Concordia have an ethical oversight body? Do you know if Concordia does? Anyone know what that might be? Maybe, maybe not. That's okay. Concordia, most academic institutions have to legally have an ethics committee and review board. So Concordia does have an ethics committee and an institutional review board is what it's called. And we'll actually get into that, what actually that is and what it consists of. But these types of bodies at these institutions evaluate like research proposals. So if you're going to do a research project, you have to get it through IRB, Institutional Review Board at Concordia approval first to ensure that your study is meeting ethical standards, particularly for research involving human subjects, and it's particularly for vulnerable subjects. For instance, when I was at Concordia, I did a research project on individuals experiencing homelessness, and I had to go through this IRB process, and they were very stringent on me. And I was scared. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. What is this process? This is very in depth. And then, but when you actually understand and dive deeper on why they're there, because these are vulnerable populations, people experiencing homelessness. So there's making sure that the researchers here are actually protecting their identity and making sure that there is no harm placed on these individuals. Same thing that goes with any type of population, especially other vulnerable populations like kids or people under 18, whatever it might be. So again, the importance of ethics in sociology. So sociologists, we study human behavior and we're trying to uncover patterns and generate insights. And so while our primary goal is often to understand, these insights can also inspire action and improve lives, right? And we're dealing with people. Like that should be an overall goal for a lot of our research. So research on social inequality influences oftentimes policies on poverty and education and things like that. That's a great thing. And so we have a lot of responsibility as researchers, and sociologists carry a significant ethical obligation to avoid harm to individuals, to avoid harm to different communities and groups that is involved in our studies. And so this includes like respecting privacy, obtaining informed consent, minimizing risks to participants. We're going to talk about each of those. So I think there might have been a link to maybe the Canadian Sociological Association, maybe one of the readings. And that's just a really good example of the type of leading organization for sociologists that we adhere to standards like that. So I mentioned we would talk about voluntary participation. Anyone can take a stab at what is voluntary participation when we're talking about research? Any guesses?
Just that like the participants know and willingly like are participating, so they're not like being studied without their knowledge.
100%. Absolutely. Yeah. Participants have to choose freely to take part in your study without pressure or without coercion or any undue influence there. And informed consent is a key requirement of that. So ensuring that participants understand what is the purpose of the research that's being done. What does their participation involve? Are they answering questions about via a survey or an interview, and what are those types of questions going to be? And then making sure they're aware of any potential risks or even benefits of conducting or taking part in this research. So it's really important because it does a few things here. So it protects autonomy. So voluntary participation respects individuals' rights to make decisions about their involvement in the study, whether they want to continue to be involved or whether they want to quit halfway through, whatever it is, that's voluntary participation. It also helps to build trust. So as a researcher, these sort of ethical practices really enhances your credibility of research and of your findings, because you're being transparent with the participants and you're being transparent with anyone who else is going to maybe replicate or look into your study. And then preventing harm. That was already mentioned as well, because that is critical to ensure that no one feels like they're forced to participate in a study, especially more vulnerable groups. And that does two things. One, it does prevent harm, but it also prevents swayed data, because if people feel forced to participate, that data is going to look differently than if it's voluntary. So there are a couple of key considerations here as well. So different elements of what voluntary participation also includes. So the right to withdrawal. So I kind of mentioned this, that participants can stop their involvement at any time without penalty or consequence. That if you're in the middle of, let's say I'm interviewing Jacob and I'm like, hey, this is going really well, this interview is great, but Jacob's like, hey, I actually want to go. We're halfway through. I can't force you to complete the rest of that interview. Same with the survey. You can quit at any time. And that also leads to avoiding coercion is another one too. So researchers have to ensure that incentives, so types of like if you're paid to do a survey, those things don't become a supreme amount of pressure to complete the survey. So I can't lie, I couldn't ethically say, hey, you all should complete this study and I'll give you all A pluses. Like that would not be, that'd be so coercive, and that it would be ridiculous. And so those are the types of ethical standards. Just like I couldn't say, hey, I'll give you $10,000 to complete this 5-minute survey and send that out to the general population. That would just be ridiculous. But I can give you $5 to complete or a $5 gift card. Those are the types of smaller sort of incentives that are more acceptable. And then that special populations as well. So additional care is needed for groups with limited ability to give or obtain informed consent, such as like minors or individuals with cognitive disabilities, those sorts of populations. There's additional standards that exist for them. So it's just really important to understand ethics in terms of why we're actually doing this, and then what voluntary participation actually includes, including like even unfavorable consequences. So I couldn't, let's say if I was like, hey, Katie, I really want you to do the survey, and Katie's like, I don't really want to do the survey. I can't like give you a bad grade for that or be like mean to you in class or whatever it is, loss of employment or lack of pay, whatever it might be. We have to avoid those things, obviously, as well. So harmlessness is another one. So harmlessness was also mentioned, and that this is just pure and simple. Participants will not be harmed as a result for their participation or their non-participation in the project, in any sort of research initiative. Any examples that you can think of what could be examples of harm from a research study that you have to be careful of? Any ideas, any guesses? Whether it's in sociology or psychology or medical type of research, any thoughts?
Not respecting someone's anonymity.
Yeah, right. Releasing their identity, gave private opinions about something, you release their identity, and maybe that results in, a type of social situation where they feel ousted from a peer group or something like that. Absolutely. Those sorts of social ramifications can absolutely exist. And think about other industries as well. So think about medical. So maybe it's harmful health related outcomes as a part of a study. So medical research has to be very careful that making sure that when they have to reduce as much harm as possible. Yeah, Jamie.
Depending on how like detrimental the study is, like trauma could definitely be a possibility as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're conducting a study about something that's very traumatic or that's very triggering for certain populations, that can be a level of harm too. So whether that be in, psychological or sociological studies, absolutely, that's important to consider. So we look at all these things, and that's what we think about with harmlessness, that we have to make sure that we're not harming our participants by them taking place in the study. One really horrible example in history of a study that did commit harm is that, has anyone heard of the Tuskegee syphilis studies? Way back. Yeah, Luke's nodding. So participants were denied treatment for syphilis, causing severe health consequences. There was a racial component of this as well, as most participants were Black Americans. So this took place many, many decades ago, but a primary example of one of these catalyst events that helped create better ethical standards boards, especially in the United States. So there's countless examples before these ethics boards were really created about why they were needed. So 5 steps to ensure harmlessness. You see them up on the slides here. Just going through them quickly. One is managing vulnerability. So this is where you're identifying and addressing systemic inequalities that may heighten a participant's risk. So protecting vulnerable groups like minors, refugees, those with more stigmatized conditions, all those sorts of people, we have to understand that vulnerability. And then 2, obtaining informed consent. So providing very clear and accessible information about the study, including the risks and benefits and their rights as participants. Also using appropriate methods for vulnerable or these sort of participants that I've mentioned of these vulnerable communities. So like verbal consent is an example. 3, protecting participants and their data. So making sure that we're following principles of non-malevolence. So we're avoiding that harm there, about making sure that their data just isn't spread out everywhere, that it's private and confidential, ensuring anonymity, confidentiality, and secure, safe data storage. And then also offering support or counseling when needed. To Jamin's point, if you're doing a study about something very triggering or very intense, let's say it's a study about PTSD or something with veterans, offering sort of counseling resources or support or education and information about if you need support, here's where to go, or even having the resources to actually directly offer it. Number 4, identify and manage risks. So conducting a risk benefit analysis during the study design phase is often done. So adapting to unexpected risks too. So things like civil unrest, pandemics, like things that should happen that we're not expecting, having to adapt to that. And then providing support resources similar to the previous point for participants. And then number 5, finally, championing human rights and justice. So as sociologists, remember, a huge goal of sociology is to have more actionable research of how we're making a difference. So advocating for positive societal outcomes through your research, addressing local problems, global problems, whatever it might be, with a focus on that sort of social equity component. That's a really large piece of it. As we're doing sociology research, what's the point we're trying to get to? We're trying to better our community. So just kind of a big key takeaway is that ethical research isn't just about avoiding harm. It's also about actively promoting well-being and respect and justice for your participants. There's more of that actionable piece. You're not just avoiding harm. You want to have some sort of positive outcome where available out of your research. So I've mentioned informed consent like 18 times talking about this. A hit on the previous side, but informed consent is really, really important. So all research participants must receive and sign informed consent, whether it's a document electronically or on paper, having some sort of document that they're acknowledging informed consent that they are participating in this study. Some sort of document or statement that clearly describes their right to refuse participation, as well as the right to withdraw or before their responses in the study can actually be recorded. All the rights as a participant that you do have. So for subjects under the age of 18, informed consent has to be done with parents' permission as well. So I just want to give you a quick example about like what a really minor informed consent looks like from the standpoint of a survey, because you're going to be building this out. Can you see this Qualtrics page? Okay. So for example, you're going to actually do this, which is super fun. You're going to get into Qualtrics and write up a sort of preamble like this. This is a very simplified preamble, but essentially what it's doing, it's talking about, okay, what is this study about? What does it kind of entail? Giving certain directions on the study. And then do you wish to continue with the survey? Yes or no. So participants right away can state, yes, I want to continue, or no, I don't want to actually take this survey. So you're going to be actually building this out and writing these sorts of survey questions. It's going to be your name in there. It's going to be very fun. You can even be more specific about, if folks have that right to withdraw at any time, or if they want their data destroyed. So that's an option as well, where, so you've already completed the study, but someone, 2 months from now, when you're analyzing the data, says, I actually don't want my data recorded anymore. They have a legal right for you to take their data out of the survey. So other examples of informed consent, let's say you're doing interviews and you need to print out an actual consent form where folks read and sign and date, and you both get a copy of it. That's another example of informed consent. It's really a foundational component of research ethics, and it's just very, very important. So anonymity and confidentiality, we're getting towards, let's see. Yeah, we'll get towards the last, about halfway through. So anonymity and confidentiality. Can someone try their best just to describe the difference between anonymity and confidentiality? What do you think is the difference between the two? It can be a little tricky. Any guesses? I don't know. That's okay. That's why I'm here. So putting you on the spot. So anonymity and confidentiality are very much related, but they're somewhat separate concepts. So anonymity as you see up there, is where the researcher or the readers, whoever it is who are looking at this data, can't actually identify individual participants. So maybe it's an anonymous link through a survey, like the type you would build out in Qualtrics, where you just have one link that goes out to 1,000 different people. You can't tell which specific individual actually responded. So that's an anonymous survey. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is a little different. It's that the researcher can actually identify a person's responses, but guarantees not to divulge the person's identity. So for example, in an interview, right? Like let's say you do 15 interviews and write up a study. Well, let's say I did interviews with all of you. I know what Alex said. I know what Jamin said. I know what Sam and Ezra. I know what all of you individually said because I have the interview recordings and the transcriptions. But in my report, none of your identities are actually divulged. And in fact, you probably, if I use a quote and have someone's name, I'm going to change your name. You're going to get a pseudonym. So Alex is going to be Michael. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with names. But for example, that's what we did. That's what we did at Springtide. We would have fun with it at Springtide, where we had like hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and we got so bored, and it got harder than you think trying to come up with fake names. Because you start using the same ones over and over again. You can't do that. So we started doing like Marvel characters and like actors' names. And then so we actually got in trouble as an associate researcher back in Springtime, because we had like Robert De Niro. And we're like, you can't use Robert De Niro as a pseudonym. What are you doing? Like, I'm sorry, it's been late night. Anyway, those are really key concepts. And it depends on the study what you have to use, but you have to use at least one of these in most cases, that you have to remain either anonymous and or confidential. So de-identification, that's the process I just referenced, right? So altering any identifying information. So let's say even if you're in an interview and someone says, you know, my mom, Susie at 1110 Washington Drive in Millbank, South Dakota, she thinks this way on the subject. Well, maybe that's some good information, but as a researcher, I'm not going to include, hey, this person's mom's name is Susie and lives at this address, because that would be identifying information. So we de-identify anything that could tie individual responses back. And that's really important in academic research, obviously, but also private sector consulting and nonprofits, human services, because we're safeguarding those vulnerable populations, right? So we're preventing any misuse of data, any sort of negative consequences. Like when I will continue to do consulting in organizations and I'm interviewing and surveying these people, I don't want the CEO to know what this entry-level employee said negatively about them, because that could result in their employment being suspended or any sort of other negative repercussions. So it's really, really key, that anonymity and confidentiality piece. Disclosure. So this is where researchers are providing, any sort of potential participants that key information about the study. So it's before you're even collecting the data itself, or you're providing any type of information that's going to be helpful for folks making an informed decision about whether they're actually going to participate. So think of who, why, what, and who again. That's kind of what we want to think about here. So who is conducting the study, who or why the study is being conducted. So what's actually the purpose of the study, what outcomes are expected, and then who will benefit from the results. So it's really, really important that we have disclosure, but in some cases, full disclosure can also influence participants' responses, leading to maybe biased or unreliable data. Can you imagine at any point, any sort of situation, can you guess for a situation where disclosing who is doing the study might influence who actually completes the study or how they respond? Any guesses?
If the person is liked or disliked, they could like bias their opinion based on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's a really great example. So I'll do a little comparison for you. So like, let's say if Pew Research or a Gallup poll, we're like, I mean, it's some organization that's all about nonpartisan, whatever. Like, whatever, I don't know who that is. I'm going to complete that survey. But let's say if we're doing political polling and I see political polling from Pew versus political polling from the team of Joe Biden or the team of Donald Trump, you're going to get very different people completing those surveys. Because if people see that, hey, this is a poll that's actually being done by a certain political candidate, more people who are maybe on that candidate's side, quote unquote, or supportive of that candidate are probably going to complete that. So when we think of political polling, internal political polls mean nothing to social scientists. We're like, we do not care what certain folks' teams' internal polls said because you never know who actually you're getting to respond. But folks like Gallup and Pew, where they're third parties and very nonpartisan, that's where that data becomes a bit more viable. And even like teacher administered surveys. So like if I was like, hey, I've got this survey, I want you all to respond to it, but I'm going to know each of your individual responses. And it's like, do you like Professor Zimney or not? And you're like, well, I'm not going to say no. Like, what are you talking about? You know I'm responding. That's another example of like how bias can come in with disclosure. So again, disclosure is still critical for informed consent, but researchers have to balance that transparency with that risk of bias. And in academic research, there's a lot of nuances here that we can ensure that we don't fall into that bias strain. Value neutrality. This is just pretty straightforward, but this is all about remaining impartial. So you're not having any bias or judgment during the course of a study, or even in publishing your results, that you're remaining impartial as a researcher. So even if we have information that we disagree with, or not even disagree, but hey, we did not want this result, right? If I'm doing a satisfaction survey about my mom, and then I learned that like, wow, half of everyone in this class hates my mom for some reason. Like I still got to publish those results. I'm not going to fish. I'm not going to fib, right? I'm like, don't hate on Christy, my mom, because she's the best person. Yeah, that's right, Luke. Our moms have the same name. That's why Christy Loberg's the best. So if anyone hasn't talked to Christy Loberg before, she's the sweetest person I think I've ever met. Anyway, sorry, Luke, I just got sidetracked. You're like, why are you like fangirling over this? Anyway. So the point is we have to remain impartial. We can't have bias. We can't have judgment, both during the process, but also as we're reporting those results as well. So in the kind of connection back to the role of, in the prior recordings, like that subjective, objective conversation we had, right? I think that should have been in the recordings last week about how do we reduce our subjectivity as researchers, remain objective and impartial about our results. So I mentioned an institutional review board, right? I mentioned that these are the types, and it's an example of an ethics organization that Concordia, for example, has, and most academic higher ed institutions have them. So what are institutional review boards? What are IRBs? So these are committees that are actually required at institutions receiving any sort of federal funds for research. So especially federal funds for research involving human subjects or animal subjects, for example, and it's established under what's called the Common Rule to ensure these ethical research practices, all the sorts of things and more that we've talked about over the last half hour or so. So Concordia does have an IRB. Has anyone here gone through the IRB process before? Maybe you will someday. It's a fun process. It's the most fun process you can ever go through by just filling out a bunch of really dry, detailed information about your study. It's super boring, but it's super important too. So IRBs, what they do is they oversee all the sorts of research proposals that happen at the college to ensure compliance with US government regulations. So all the stuff we've talked about and the things that, it's hard to even remember, it's not necessarily just up to you and just your duty as an individual researcher to remember that. It's these IRBs that are really important. So they evaluate, the risk versus the benefit of the study, consent procedures that you're going to take, the fairness, are everyone treated fair, all those sorts of things they evaluate. And they help to protect people from harm, right? That's really important. They ensure that studies are ethically sound. They require that we as researchers are adhering to these standards, and they will either approve or deny that your research gets funding, and that's really important. So these are a couple steps 1 through 6 in the IRB process. It can be varied institution to institution, but this is fairly typical. So number 1, human participant research training. So you're completing the required certifications. So sometimes there's a lot of online training, like maybe it's interview training or cultural competence training. There's stuff like that where you're going to have to do before you can actually conduct the research in many cases. 2, your project design. So ensuring that your study is actually well planned and aligns with ethical procedures. They're going to take a look at that. You're going to have to provide lots of information and very detailed information about how you're going about this. And then 3, you're actually going to submit your protocol. So choosing the appropriate forms and completing it and submitting your proposal, all that sort of bureaucratic stuff that's an absolute blast that we all look forward to in our life. You do that as well. IRB approval then as well. or IRB review rather. So the IRB committee evaluates your protocol for any ethical considerations, and then they allow you to iterate and revise, step number 5. So they give you feedback. Maybe they deny you at first, but they allow you to iterate and address any issues that they've identified with your study design. You make changes, and then you resubmit. And then your post-approval activities like report updates, maybe they're checking in on how the survey or the study is going. You're managing any amendments that you had to make, and then you submit a final report after the study. So how did it go? Did any issues come up that were maybe not identified, or any issues that are coming up in general? So they want to make sure that they're staying on top of that. And then it's your role to have that sort of transparency as well. So IRB is very important, not a fun process necessarily, but if you're going to get into academia at all, if you're going to go to grad school, you're gonna do plenty of this. So just be aware of what that process looks like. It's a blast. Finally, this is the last slide I have for today, and then I just have a reminder again. But ethics in question. So the Alice Goffman case. So we read about this. This is in one of the readings, and Alice Goffman is a sociologist, and she was doing an ethnography. So has anyone heard of what an ethnography is? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe in prior recordings. I don't know. So an ethnography is just an example of a qualitative research methods where it's a really hands-on, immersive approach to studying, say, a group or an organization through like participation and observation. So like an ethnography would be like, if I'm going to study a group of college students, I'm actually going to go into that group as a college student. So like maybe like I'm going to enroll, or I'm going to like fake that I'm a college student, actually participate in that group and then observe that way. So it's really, really an intensive sort of like you're living with that group. And so the goal is really to understand in a really inclusive way and holistic way a group's culture and behaviors and dynamics from their perspective. It's very intensive. It's a really interesting form of sociological study. But what happened in the Alice Goffman case? Right? Did anyone remember what happened in the Alice Goffman case that we read? It's okay if you don't.
Didn't she get like accused of like exaggerating information or just kind of misrepresenting what actually happened?
Yeah, A, B, C, D, all the above. That's right. All of those things. 100%. It's such an interesting case. So Alice Goffman conducted this ethnography in her book called On the Run, which is a fascinating read, especially with these things in mind. And she studied how a young African-American man in a poor Philadelphia neighborhood, the group dynamics, all that sort of stuff. And so the book described her struggles with territorial conflicts, law enforcement, systemic inequities and inequalities. And then Goffman really embedded herself in the community and described her methods at the end of the book and whatnot. But there were a lot of ethical concerns that were raised. And Alice Goffman is a really interesting case because her father is a very, very famous sociologist, and she was on this tenure track. And so there are a few different ethical concerns raised about the book. And they're raised in that reading for today too. And so number one was informed consent. We talked about that, right? So participants reportedly did not know that they were a part of a research study. That's one part of ethnography, but we're not even informed of any time throughout this long process. And that raised questions about exploitation, their right to autonomy, whether they acted certain ways, whether they were divulged certain information. They also allegations of misconduct. So various critics accused Goffman of faking details, like Sam said, faking and exaggerating details, failing to meet those academic research standards, like through an IRB type of body, and then participating even in illegal activities while embedding herself in the community. So this is an interesting line we'd have to draw, right? Because she's obviously, Alice Goffman was in a very interesting situation. But what is our goal in academic research? It's not just to avoid harm, but also to promote good things as well, right? Promote justice and equity and a better understanding. So by participating very handedly in illegal activities, that goes against that level of harmlessness, right? Whether it's participating in things like being a getaway car for a robbery or whatnot, that just doesn't adhere to those ethical standards that we are supposed to adhere to. And then three, impact on the community. So thinking about like, did this study harm the community it actually profiled? Did it divulge so much information that some people said that they could tie some responses? They weren't de-identified enough. So part of these groups, they were able to tie back, James said this, or Suzanne said this, and that can promote harm in that community. And then Goffman's presence and her work, was it actually beneficial, or was it more exploitative for other methods? So there's a lot of really interesting gray area ethical concerns. And the reason why I added this reading is just show you an example of what, like, a very prominent book. So it was like a bestseller, like this was a big thing. And then it really has been kind of eroded in the reputation around it because she didn't adhere to those ethical standards. So be thinking about those things. It's really, really important just to understand why we need ethical standards and whatnot. But that's all I've got for today. Just another reminder to make sure that SPSS is working. So test it out, go download that example data set if you can. And then a reminder that Monday is MLK Day. So don't come to class. Don't come to Old Main 302. I'll yell at you if you do. I'm not going to yell at you. I'll never yell at you, I promise. But no one will be there and you'll be bored. So go relax on MLK Day. But remember to reflect on why this is a federal holiday. But other than that, y'all are free to go. I'll stay after a few minutes for anyone who does have questions. Thanks, everybody.